Good morning, boys and girls. So today we are going to read a story called Mr. Mell Goes to Camp. Now, before we begin, it's important to understand what a cello is because this story will talk about a cello. Now, a cello is like a big violin. So, you've seen a violin before where it's played on the shoulder and you use a bow to drag across the strings and make a sound. Well, a cello looks a lot like a violin, except it's so big. It's big enough to fit between the player's legs, and they have to use a bow that's probably about the size of this yardstick to make some really, really deep sounds as they play. That is what a cello is. So, listen very carefully as we read the story. As we've talked about, good stories have a problem that needs to be solved. I want you to pay very close attention to how the problems in this story are being solved, okay? So let's begin. Mr. Mell goes to camp. One summer, Mr. Benson and his cello, Mr. Mell, took a vacation from the orchestra they played in. Isn't that silly? He named his cello Mr. Mell. They went to Camp Crescendo to teach music. Mr. Mell couldn't stand summer camp. His strings ached from the damp breezes blowing off the lake. The crickets chirped so loudly he couldn't hear himself play. Worst of all was Mr. Benson's student Sam. Mr. Mell shivered at the squawks and screeches that came from Sam's cello. So what problem does Mr. Mell notice about Sam's playing? Sam makes squawks and screeches on his cello. Now, I know that cello music should not sound like squawks and screeches. It should sound low and beautiful and smooth, shouldn't it? One afternoon, Mr. Benson and Mr. Mell were on their way to the practice cabin when they saw Sam and a friend take a canoe out to the lake. Watching Sam skim over the water and out of sight, Mr. Mell thought that Sam was much better at paddling a canoe than playing a cello. At 3 o'clock, it was nearly time for Sam's lesson. "Let's go practice by the lake," suggested Mr. Benson. "We'll wait for Sam, and he can have his lesson outside." Mr. Mell worried about getting sand in his strings, but he could tell that Mr. Benson liked the idea of an outdoor lesson. Mr. Benson and Mr. Mell sat under the picnic shelter at the lake. The water lapping against the boat dock seemed to keep time to their music. Suddenly, dark clouds rolled over the sun. "I'm afraid a storm is blowing up," said Mr. Benson, anxiously playing a little faster. "I hope Sam gets back soon." Mr. Mell could tell that Mr. Benson didn't have his mind on his playing, so he played louder to remind Mr. Benson to concentrate on the music. The clouds began to look more threatening. Lightning flashed, lighting up the lake. Thunder boomed. "Oh dear," wailed Mr. Benson, playing even louder and faster. "I wish Sam would hurry. A bad storm is coming." Mr. Mell wished Mr. Benson would take him back to the practice cabin before the rain warped his sides. Now let me ask, why is Sam in danger? Why do you think Sam is in danger? He is in a canoe on the lake and a storm is coming. Now, do you know what happens when lightning strikes water? It electrocutes everything in the water. Also, when a storm comes, it's often very windy and very wet. And so, what happens in choppy water? Well, a canoe can tip over, so Sam is really in danger. Just then, a boat appeared in the distance. It quickly grew bigger and bigger as it approached the dock. "They're back!" cried Mr. Benson, playing a happy run on Mr. Mell's strings. Just as the rain began to pour, Sam and his friend jumped from the canoe. Sam ran to join Mr. Benson and Mr. Mell under the shelter. "I thought we'd never get here," cried Sam, panting and puffing. "We headed for shore as soon as we saw the storm clouds, but I couldn't tell where the camp was. Then I heard Mr. Mell's music over the noise of the storm, and I followed it home." Mr. Benson beamed happily and patted Mr. Mell's strings. So how does Sam find his way back to camp? Mr. Mell plays louder and louder, so Sam was able to follow the sounds of the music back to camp. The last night at Camp Crescendo, Sam said goodbye. He shook Mr. Benson's hand and strummed Mr. Mell's strings. "Next summer, I'll practice until I can make my cello sound like you, Mr. Mell," said Sam. "And I won't get lost on the lake again. Thank you for helping me find my way back." Mr. Mell was happy that Sam was going to practice, and he was even happier that camp was over and he was going home. So how does Mr. Mell help make Sam want to become a better cello player? Well, Sam wants to learn how to make his own cello sound like Mr. Mell, and he plans to practice even more until next summer. So, in this story, were you surprised at how Sam solved his problem of being caught on the lake as the storm approached? Do you remember how that problem was solved? It was solved by Mr. Mell's strings, by his music. His music brought Sam home. Now, there was another problem at the beginning of the story. What problem was it? Mr. Mell didn't like it very much. Sam was not very good at his cello. But was that problem solved at the end of the story? It was, because Sam promised to practice more so he can sound just like Mr. Mell, so he could make his cello sound just like that. So thank you for listening, and I will see you later.